For 15 years, Aurora carried one question in her heart. Why did her parents leave her? They vanished when she was still a child, leaving her to be raised by her strict but dependable Aunt Livia. And just when Aurora finally began accepting that her real family was the woman who stayed, everything changed. After Livia passed away and left her a fortune, Aurora's biological parents suddenly appeared with tears, apologies, and claims of love. But their timing was too perfect. Were they back for their daughter or for the money? One letter from beyond the grave was about to reveal the truth.
My name is Clara, I'm 26, and my life just flipped upside down. Yesterday, I inherited a fortune. My grandfather Arthur left me everything $5 million, his iconic lakeside mansion, and his entire architectural firm. I was lost in grief when the last people I ever expected to see walked in. My parents. The same ones who vanished 10 years ago without a trace. They beamed at me, acting like no time had passed at all. "We're here to guide you," my mother cooed. Before I could process that, my lawyer entered the room. The second they saw him, their smiles froze and their faces turned to ghosts. But let me back up so you can understand just how insane this all was. I remember when my life was simple, back when I was 16, living in a small 2-bedroom condo. My mother seemed to adore me. Dad had passed away years earlier, so it was just us. Mom was a curator at a contemporary art gallery. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Saturdays spent at museums, summers exploring street art festivals. Christmases smelled like oil paint and turpentine. But I was too young to see the cracks forming, the hushed arguments about credit card bills. The mysterious art investor's mom was always meeting for dinner, the expensive gifts for her new artist boyfriend that suddenly appeared, even as our own fridge grew empty. My mother had always loved the art world, but her new boyfriend, Mark, dragged her into its most toxic circles. One night, I heard her on the phone with the bank, begging for an extension on our mortgage. He'd just brush it off, promising a big commission was just around the corner. His promises were cheap canvas, easily painted over and forgotten. Mom started to change too. Her passion turned into desperation. She started missing my school events, spending late nights at gallery openings with him. The condo grew quiet and tense. When I asked about money, she'd snap that everything was fine, then look at me with this haunted expression, like she was trying to burn my face into her memory. So I tried to be perfect. I got straight A's, won a scholarship, and never asked for anything. I cleaned the condo without being told. I figured if I was an easy enough kid, if I caused no trouble at all, she would snap out of it, and everything would be okay again. The day they left is seared into my brain. It was a Monday in June. They were leaving for a 2-week art residency in Italy. My mom hugged me tight and promised to call every single day. Their suitcases were overflowing. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. Their closets were half empty. On the kitchen island, I found a hastily scribbled note from my mother. "Clara, we're not coming back. Grandpa Arthur will take care of you. This is for the best." Just like that. 16 years of my life gone in 18 words. I called my mom's phone again and again, but the international number just beeped endlessly. I checked Mark's social media and found pictures of them laughing in Paris. I had only seen my grandfather Arthur a few times. He was my dad's father, a famous architect who lived in another city. He was brilliant, demanding, and my parents always said he disapproved of their bohemian lifestyle. I had no way to reach him, no idea if he even knew what my mother had done. I spent that first night alone, too scared and ashamed to tell anyone. What if I ended up in the foster system? What if they came back and I wasn't there? I ate crackers for dinner and fell asleep on the sofa, clutching my phone. The next morning, my grandfather's assistant called. Apparently, my mother had sent him a brief email. The assistant, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, had a calm voice that cut through my panic. She booked a flight, arranged a car, and told my grandfather was handling everything. I overheard her talking to him on the phone. "Arthur, the girl's been abandoned." There was a long silence on his end. The alternative is state custody or another pause. "I know it's a shock, but she has nobody else." A brief, clipped response. "I'll be there this afternoon." She is not spending another night in that apartment alone. My grandfather Arthur showed up that evening in a black sedan that looked like it belonged to a diplomat. He wore a tailored wool coat and leather gloves, his silver hair perfectly combed. When he saw me standing there, his face showed neither pity nor warmth. It was just resolve. "Go pack a bag," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Just the essentials for now." His driver handled the logistics while I threw clothes and my laptop into a duffel bag. I stuffed my backpack with family photos and my favorite sketchbooks. I walked out of my childhood bedroom, leaving behind the posters on the wall and the life I thought I knew. The drive to Arthur's City was 3 hours long. He didn't ask how I was feeling. Instead, he pointed out bridges and buildings, giving me an impromptu lecture on structural engineering. The legal guardianship was straightforward. His lawyers handled it all. My mother and Mark never bothered to appear in court. They just signed away their parental rights through an international notary. The court tried to locate them to formally terminate their rights, but they had simply vanished into the European art scene. It was like they had never existed. That abandonment left scars that years of therapy could only trace, not erase. For years, I would wake up in a cold sweat thinking I'd heard the front door open, believing they'd come back to say it was all a terrible mistake. I wrote angry, tear-stained emails that I saved as drafts. I'd see a woman with my mother's fiery red hair in a crowd and my heart would stop. My therapist, Dr. Evans, helped me understand that their leaving was about their own failures, not mine. Adults make choices from their own broken places, she'd say. Kids blame themselves to feel a sense of control. If it's your fault, you can fix it. But this was never your mess to clean up, Clara. My head understood her words long before my heart did. Eventually, the frantic searching stopped. By the time I started college, I'd stopped checking their social media accounts. By 22, I had deleted their old numbers. By 25, I finally accepted that the parents I knew were gone for good. And through all that, Arthur was my constant, not affectionate, but always there, always dependable. He never made a promise he didn't keep. He showed up to every meeting and provided everything I needed. It was a different kind of care than the one I'd lost, but it was real. Moving into Arthur's house was like stepping onto a different planet. His modernist mansion was a masterpiece of glass and steel, set on 5 acres of pristine lakefront property. My bedroom was bigger than our entire old condo, with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture that made me feel like I was living in an art gallery. The rules here were strict and unspoken. Breakfast at 7 a.m., so schoolwork was priority 1 and no clutter, ever. An hour of sketching every day, whether I was inspired or not. Homework was done at the drafting table in my room, not lounging on the Italian leather sofas. Dinner conversation had to revolve around art, politics, or finance. No television on school nights. I broke every rule that first month, pushing every boundary, probably hoping he'd send me away so I could get the inevitable abandonment over with. But Arthur never raised his voice. Each infraction was met with a calm, logical consequence. If I was late for breakfast, I missed breakfast. If my homework wasn't done, my weekend privileges were revoked until it was completed to his standards. But beneath his rigid exterior, I sometimes saw flashes of something else, like the time he found me crying over an old photo of my dad. He didn't say anything, just quietly placed a box of tissues on my desk and left the room. Or when I nearly failed a physics exam, he didn't lecture me about effort. He just hired the best tutor in the city. Arthur had built his fortune from a single brilliant idea, turning a small firm into a global powerhouse. He worked constantly, but he was always home for dinner, often with a fresh set of blueprints to review afterwards. On weekends, my education continued at business meetings. Watch people negotiate. My aunt would say, see who talks first, who gives ground, who holds your gaze. She believed business was just psychology with a bank account. She valued education above all. So when my public school wasn't cutting it, she sent me to Westfield Academy, a private school with a heavy price tag and even heavier expectations. The shift was brutal. I was academically unprepared, and the other kids came from a world of wealth I couldn't imagine. I spent most nights buried in books, just trying to keep my head above water. Some nights I just wanted to give up, certain I'd never belong in that world of privilege. But Aunt Livia didn't do defeat. One night, I was crying over homework when she said, your circumstances changed, not because of you. How you responded is all on you. You can either grab this opportunity or watch it disappear. But I don't invest in lost causes. It wasn't the comfort I wanted, but her brutal honesty worked. It lit a fire under me. I used my allowance to hire a tutor and started study groups with classmates. By junior year, I'd clawed my way onto the honor roll. But then came college applications, a whole new kind of stress. I wanted to go to the state university with all my friends. Aunt Livia pushed for more prestigious schools. Your friends are thinking about parties, she said. You need to be thinking about your entire future. This led to the biggest fight we ever had. I screamed that she was trying to run my life, and she shot back that I was throwing away my potential because I was scared. I never asked to be your project, I yelled. And I never asked to be your guardian, she replied, her voice ice cold. But here we are. I am giving you the choices your parents never had. Her words shut me down completely, and in the silence, she did something I never expected. She told me about my father. Your dad was brilliant, she said softly. He was a math whiz, but our parents couldn't afford college for him. He ended up at a gas station while I got the scholarship. She explained he grew resentful, turning to gambling to get rich since school was off the table. My mother, she said, was just as smart but just as trapped. I will not let that cycle repeat with you. It was the first time she'd ever spoken of my parents without a trace of anger. I finally got a picture of their lives, and her relentless academic pressure on me suddenly made perfect sense. I applied to 7 colleges and got into 5, ultimately choosing Northwestern for its business program. Aunt Livia paid the full tuition without a single complaint, though I knew it was a huge expense. College was freedom. I joined clubs, made diverse new friends, and found talents I never knew I had, like a knack for design that perfectly matched the financial lessons she drilled into me. My summers were spent as an intern at her company, where I learned everything from supply chains to client dinners. Our whole relationship changed during those years. The distance actually brought us closer. Our Sunday calls became real conversations, full of actual laughter. When I graduated with honors, I could see the pride in her eyes, even if all she offered was a firm handshake. Afterward, I moved back in and became her marketing director. We fell into an easy rhythm, 2 professional women sharing a house and a life. I tried dating, but Aunt Livia hated any relationship she thought was a distraction from my career. Then, 2 years ago, our world collapsed. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was bad from day one, but she faced it like a business problem. When I fell apart, she told me, "We all die. The only question is how we use our time." She worked as long as she could, slowly handing more responsibility to me. Our roles began to reverse. I started managing her meds, her doctor appointments, and her meals. In her final months, a softness I'd never seen emerged. One night, helping her to bed, she grabbed my hand. "You were the daughter I never let myself have," she whispered. "Taking you in was the best business decision I ever made." She passed away in her sleep 8 months after her diagnosis. The funeral was small, mostly work colleagues. Standing there at her grave, I realized I had just lost my parent. The grief was suffocating. The house felt cavernous and silent. I had to catch myself listening for her footsteps, or saving news articles to show her. I kept the business exactly as she would have, honoring her with my work, not just my tears. I truly believed I would never see my biological parents again until the will reading. 3 weeks after the funeral, a letter arrived from Harold Lawson, her lawyer of 3 decades. The reading was Tuesday at 10 a.m. It mentioned all interested parties would be present. I just assumed that meant me and maybe a few charities. Lawson was a man from another era, with a full head of white hair and glasses he preferred to look over instead of through. His office smelled of leather and old paper, with a huge wooden desk where countless lives had probably been changed. I arrived 15 minutes early, in a navy suit Aunt Livia would have approved of. Lawson offered his condolences, then explained we were waiting on a few other people. I sat in a leather chair, trying to read a magazine, but the words wouldn't focus. Then the door opened. I glanced up, expecting to see one of her executives, and in that instant, time just stopped. Standing in the doorway were the 2 people I thought I'd never see again. My parents. My father had been ravaged by time. His hair was thin and gray, his face was deeply lined, and his shoulders slumped with a heavy, invisible weight. He'd gained at least 50 pounds, turning his old athletic frame soft. My mother was somehow even more changed. Her hair was a harsh, unflattering cut, her face bony and gaunt. She had permanent dark circles under her eyes, and her smile was an empty gesture. She clutched her old purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "Ella," my father rasped, his voice gravelly, "you're all grown up." They walked toward me, and I stood on shaky legs. My mother reached for a hug, but I couldn't respond. I just stood there, stiff as a board, as she wrapped her arms around me. Her perfume was a ghost from a past life. "We tried to find you," my mother said, pulling back to inspect me. "You look just like your aunt, so professional." My own voice sounded strange when I asked, "How did you know to be here?" My father tried a weak, sad smile. "We saw the obituary. We've been watching from afar. We knew you were with Livia." Of course. Of course they knew where I was all those years, and they never called. The room felt like it was tilting. "Please, have a seat," Lawson interrupted, gesturing to the chairs. "We have one more person to wait for." Just then, an older woman entered Mrs. Grayson, Livia's housekeeper for more than 20 years. She'd always been quietly kind to me. She gave me a look of pure sympathy before choosing a seat by the window, putting as much space as possible between herself and my parents. While we waited, they started making surreal small talk. "We live in Arizona now," my mother offered. "The dry heat is better for your father's arthritis." My father mentioned he runs a small hardware store now. "It's not much," he said, "but it pays the bills." I just nodded, my mind a million miles away. Inside, I was a storm of grief, anger, and a confusing flicker of hope, all fighting for control. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and opened a thick folder. "We are gathered to execute the last will of Arthur Vance," he said formally. "I will summarize the key provisions before distributing copies." My parents leaned forward just slightly, a move that made their reason for being here painfully clear. They didn't come for me. They came for the money. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses. "To my granddaughter Clara Evans, I bequeath my entire estate. This includes the property at 18 Beacon Hill Place, all of its contents, and the attached gardens. My controlling interest in Vance Innovations valued it at approximately $15 million. All bank accounts, investment portfolios, and trust funds totaling nearly $3 million in liquid assets. And finally, my personal effects, including all artwork, vehicles, and the intellectual property related to my life's work." The room went dead silent. I expected something, of course, but the sheer scale of the inheritance left me breathless. My grandfather was successful, but I never grasped just how much wealth he had built. My father cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling, is there anything else?" The lawyer peered at him over his glasses. "There are some smaller bequests for long-serving employees," he replied, nodding toward Arthur's assistant, "and detailed instructions for the family's charitable foundation. However, the vast majority of the estate is allocated to Clara, as stated." My mother's smile looked painted on. "Well, that is a tremendous responsibility for someone so young, and in her condition," she said, patting my arm. Her touch felt more like a claim than comfort. "Thankfully, we're here to help guide her." Mr. Sterling simply raised an eyebrow, his silence more telling than words. My father quickly added, trying to sound helpful, "Legally, since Clara is in a vulnerable position, and our parental rights were never officially terminated, we do have an interest in her welfare." The panic that hit me was immediate and cold. After 15 years of nothing, they wanted to take control of my life and my baby's future. I opened my mouth to argue, but Mr. Sterling spoke first. "I believe there is some confusion about the legal realities of the situation," he said in an even tone. "Perhaps it's best we continue this tomorrow, when I can have all the necessary documents prepared. Shall we say 2 p.m.? My parents exchanged a swift glance before my father nodded. "That sounds fine. We're at the Fairmont downtown. We could meet for lunch before Clara, to properly catch up." Before I could even think of a reply, Mr. Sterling stood up. "If you will excuse us, I need to discuss some urgent and confidential matters with my client." My parents hesitated, clearly not wanting to leave. "We'll see you tomorrow then, sweetheart," my mother said, forcing a hug on me that I didn't return. "We have so much to talk about." As they pulled on their coats, my father handed me a card with their numbers on the back. "Call anytime," he said, "day or night. We've got 15 years of catching up to do." The door barely clicked shut before I collapsed back into my chair, hands trembling. "They can't really have any legal standing, can they?" I asked Mr. Sterling. The attorney's face was grim. "You should prepare for a very difficult conversation tomorrow." He told me, "Your grandfather foresaw this possibility, but I need time to put his plans into motion." Arthur's assistant came over before she left, gently squeezing my shoulder. "Your grandfather was a very clever man," she said softly. "Trust that he never would have left you unprotected." I left the office in a complete fog, ignoring 3 calls from my mother before I even got to my car. The childhood dream of my parents returning had finally come true. But instead of joy, all I felt was a deep, chilling anxiety. Against Mr. Sterling's advice, I agreed to meet them for dinner that evening. A part of me just had to hear the answers only they could provide. I chose a public place, a busy seafood restaurant my grandfather had loved. They were already seated when I walked in, my father jumping up to pull out my chair with an exaggerated flourish. My mother had put on fresh makeup and styled her hair, looking more like the woman from my distant memories. "We ordered a Chardonnay," my father said. "I remember your mother always liked it." "I don't drink wine," I replied, asking for water instead. It was a small boundary, but it felt important to show them I wasn't the child they had left behind. The first 20 minutes were a blur of awkward small talk. They asked about my education, my late husband, my pregnancy. I gave short answers, scanning their faces for any sign of the parents I once idolized. "We owe you an explanation," my mother finally said, her hand reaching for mine across the table. I kept mine wrapped around my glass. "What we did was wrong. We know that." "We were in a terrible, terrible place," my father continued. "I had lost everything in a bad business venture. Your mother was battling a severe depression. We convinced ourselves you would be better off with Arthur," my mother said. "He had stability. We had nothing to offer but our own chaos. You had each other," I said quietly. "That was all I wanted." My father stared down at his plate. "I got help for my issues. I've been clean for 8 years now. And your mother, she finally found the right doctors. We built a simple, stable life, he said. We thought about contacting you so many times, my mother added, her eyes starting to glisten. But we were ashamed. And the more time passed, the harder it felt to bridge that gap. You knew I was with my grandfather, I stated. How? They shared a look before my father answered. We checked with social services about a year after we left. They confirmed you were with family and doing well. We checked in that way every few years. The idea that they had made these quiet inquiries without ever trying to speak to me made my stomach churn. They had done just enough to soothe their own guilt. We regret our choice every single day, my mother insisted, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. Seeing you now, so successful and beautiful, it breaks my heart that we missed watching you grow up. The waiter brought our food, giving us a brief reprieve. Once he left, my father changed tracks. Arthur did very well by you, he remarked, twirling pasta on his fork. Better than we ever could have, and now he has you set for life. That brownstone must be worth $3 million in this market, my mother added casually. And the business, that is so much for one person to handle, especially at your age. I've been helping run the company for years, I replied flatly. Of course, my father said soothingly. But there's a world of difference between helping and having the final say. The legal headaches alone are huge, never mind the tax implications. My mother jumped in. Estate taxes can be absolutely devastating without the right advice. I watched them, seeing how they switched between playing on my emotions and stoking my fears. The game was becoming clear. We could help you, my father offered. We've made our mistakes, but we learned a lot about managing money the hard way. That's an interesting perspective from a man who left his family after a bad business deal. I saw my father flinch, but he recovered quickly. Those mistakes taught me valuable lessons. I know all the pitfalls to avoid now. My mother leaned in. We have a small apartment in Arizona with a mountain of credit card debt. My prescriptions are so expensive. What exactly are you asking for? I asked directly. They both seemed startled by my bluntness. It was just another reminder that they were dealing with an adult, not the child they abandoned. We aren't asking for anything, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. We just want to be in your life again. But if you wanted to help your parents get back on their feet, it would be a blessing. My mother added. 80,000 would clear our debts, my father jumped in. And another 20,000 would get us a down payment on a small house. I leaned back, a cold clarity washing over me. So $100,000 would solve your problems, I said. And what about my damages? The 15 years of therapy, the nightmares, the wondering what I did wrong, model. How much for those? My mother's tears started streaming down her face. We know money can't fix the emotional damage. We just want a chance to be a real family again. A family that starts by cutting a check, I shot back. My father's face tightened. You have to understand our position. We made a terrible mistake. Yes, but Vivian was my aunt. That fortune came from our family. Our parents gave her the startup money for her company while I got nothing. So you think you're entitled to it? I asked. Not entitled, he corrected. Just wanting to be included. We're your parents, Aurora. That has to mean something. I thought of Aunt Vivian, whose actions, not words, showed me what real parental love was. Yes, I agreed. Blood is important, but actions are so much more powerful. The rest of the dinner went on just like that, jumping between emotional blackmail and hints about money. By dessert, they'd listed several other debts and suggested I could hire them at my company for a generous salary. As we left the restaurant, my mother hugged me again, whispering, "Think about what family really means, honey. We all make errors." I drove away in a complete daze. Their story had bits of truth in it. I remembered my mom's battle with depression, my dad being gone all the time. But something about it felt rehearsed, the timing was too perfect, and their focus on money was just wrong. When I got home, there was a message on my machine from a number I didn't recognize. Miss Winters, my name is Sandra Kelly. I worked with your parents 15 years ago at First National Bank. I saw their names mentioned with Vivian Hughes's obituary, and I had to call. Please contact me before you agree to anything with them. There are things you need to know. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I read up on guardianship laws until my eyes burned. From what I could find, my parents' case looked incredibly weak. I'd been an adult for a long time now. So why did Lawson seem so concerned? What paperwork was he putting together? Around 3 in the morning, I was in Aunt Vivian's study, which was now mine, digging through her perfectly organized files. In a locked drawer I'd never touched, I found a folder marked only with the name Winters. Inside was a history I never knew existed. The next day, I walked into Lawson's office armed with Vivian's private file and my own tired research. My parents were already there with a thin man with slicked back hair. He introduced himself as Gerald Hoffman, their lawyer. Just being careful, my father said with a forced smile. These legal things can get messy. Lawson greeted them politely, but he wasn't friendly. His assistant rolled in a cart piled high with files and a laptop. The room felt less like a family meeting and more like we were preparing for a war. Before we start, Lawson said, I need to make my role clear. I am the executor of Vivian Hughes' estate and was her personal attorney for 32 years. I also represent Aurora, as per Miss Hughes' instructions. Hoffman leaned in. My clients are worried about their daughter inheriting such a massive fortune. As her legal guardians, they have a duty to make sure it's managed correctly. Lawson gave a slow nod. That is exactly what I wanted to discuss. It seems there's some confusion about who has legal standing. He opened the first folder. Let me lay out the documented history for you. He pulled out several official documents. When Aurora went to live with Vivian, a temporary guardianship was set up by the family court. Social services recorded many attempts to reach you both about a permanent plan. My mother scowled. We were going through some things, we had to move a lot. Exactly, Lawson said. After 6 months of being unable to reach you, the court set a date for a hearing on permanent guardianship. Notices were mailed to your last known addresses and published in the legal papers. My father started to fidget. We never got any of that. That's interesting, Lawson said, because someone did contact the court saying they represented you. He took out another document. A man named Louis Barker showed up with a signed paper, supposedly from both of you, agreeing to transfer permanent guardianship to Vivian Hughes. My parents shot each other a look that told me everything before my father spoke. We never gave anyone permission to represent us. Those signatures have to be fake. Lawson pushed his glasses up. Miss Hughes was worried about that too, at the time. She hired a private detective to find you and confirm what you wanted. He opened another file full of reports and photos. The investigator tracked Mr. Winter's activity at multiple casinos in Nevada during that time. He also took pictures of Mrs. Winters working as a cocktail waitress in those same casinos. When asked about Aurora's situation, you both clearly stated you wanted to give up your parental rights. All the color drained from my mother's face. My father's jaw was clenched, and what's more, Lawson went on without mercy. The detective documented a payment of $15,000 from Louis Barker to Mr. Winters the day after that paper was signed. That was a separate business deal, my father protested weakly. Lawson just ignored him. Miss Hughes funded yearly investigations to keep an eye on your situation and see if a reunion would ever be good for Aurora. I have reports for 15 years showing constant gambling, multiple evictions, getting fired from jobs, and several run-ins with debt collectors. He flipped to a new section. And of particular interest are these documented attempts by Mrs. Winters to reach Aurora when she turned 18. He slid a report over to me. 3 times Mrs. Winters called Vivian's house but hung up, and this email sent to Aurora's college address that was never delivered because it was typed in wrong. I stared at the proof of these pathetic attempts to connect, feeling a weird mix of hurt and satisfaction. But most importantly, Lawson said, pulling out a sealed envelope, Vivian left this letter to be opened only in this specific situation. He passed it to me. The envelope had my name written in Aunt Vivian's perfect script. Perhaps you'd like to read this in private? Lawson offered. I just shook my head, broke the seal, and unfolded the pages covered in her familiar handwriting. My dearest Aurora, I read out loud, my voice steadier than I felt. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and your parents have suddenly reappeared in your life. This is no accident. Over the years, I documented every time they tried to get money from me using you. My mother made a small noise of protest, but I just kept reading. 6 months after you came to live with me, your father called, demanding $50,000 to not fight the guardianship. I paid it, against my better judgment, because I was afraid a custody fight would destroy you. 3 years after that, he came back for more, saying his gambling debts put his life in danger. I refused and hired full-time security for our home instead. I looked up for a second and saw my father staring at his hands. When you turned 16, your mother called me, claiming she had cancer and needed money for the treatments. My investigator confirmed it was a lie. When you were accepted into college, they somehow found your email and asked for tuition money, so they could start over and rebuild their relationship with you. I had those messages blocked to protect you from their games. Tears were starting to blur the words, but I made myself finish. I never told you any of this because I wanted you to have a chance to heal without another betrayal. I kept hoping they would get help and become the parents you deserved. Sadly, that never happened. Now, they will try everything to get your inheritance guilt, legal threats, and emotional blackmail. The room was dead silent as I turned to the final page. Lawson has every piece of paper needed to protect you legally. The guardianship was converted to a legal adoption when you turned 16. I kept my last nest name and didn't change yours because I always hoped you two might reconcile one day. You have legally been my daughter ever since, and they have no claim on you or your inheritance. I had to stop for a second to let that sink in. Aunt Vivian had adopted me, and I never even knew. Whatever you decide to do about your biological parents is your choice. But please, protect your financial future. Being related by blood doesn't give anyone a right to your hard work or excuse their past failures. Family is built on sacrifice, not just blood. I'm so proud of you. Trust your gut. All my love, Vivian. I gently folded the note, a storm of emotions churning inside me. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. I have the adoption papers here, all filed and legally binding. I also have records of every financial request you mentioned in your letter. He then faced my stunned parents. Furthermore, Miss Dubois included a very specific clause in her will. Any challenge to these arrangements, and her entire estate goes to a charity for abandoned children. There would be nothing left for anyone. Their lawyer, looking paler by the second, whispered something to my father. We never knew about an adoption, my father said, his voice hollow. We were told it was just a temporary guardianship. By who? Mr. Sterling asked, his tone like ice. Social services, my mother chimed in. Every single communication is documented right here, Sterling replied, tapping a thick file, including the consent forms you both signed. My father's face twisted in rage. This is insane. You bought our daughter from us. I do believe the security cameras in this office are recording the conversation, Mr. Sterling noted calmly. Which sounds a lot like you admitting you accepted money to sign away your parental rights. My father shot to his feet. This isn't over. We have rights. Dad, I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I found Vivian S. private files last night. I know about the other families too. His face flickered. What other families? The Jacksons in Denver, the Romanos in Portland, and 3 other families you tracked down. All of them so-called relatives of wealthy people who had just died. It seems you've made a career out of abandoning children, only to reappear later to cash in on their inheritance. My mother started to sob, this time for real. That is not true. We made mistakes, but we would never save it. I cut her off, sick of the performance. Vivian documented everything. She even has a tape of your phone calls demanding more money. Did you really think she'd leave me unprotected? My father's anger melted away, replaced by cold calculation. Look, Maya, this is all just a huge misunderstanding. We can work this out, just us. No need for lawyers. I think we're redone here, I said, getting to my feet. Mr. Sterling, is there anything else I need to sign today? No, he answered. The estate is yours, free and clear. Your parents have no legal standing to contest the will or the adoption. Then I want them to leave. Maya, please? My mother begged. Just let us explain. 15 years, I said quietly. You had 15 years to explain. You waited until there was money. That tells me everything. Mr. Sterling pressed a button on his desk, and 2 security guards appeared at the door. These gentlemen will see you out, he told my parents. All future contact with Miss Dubois will be through my office. You can do this, my father roared, his face turning a blotchy red. She's our daughter. No, I corrected him. I was your daughter now. I am Vivian's. And she taught me to know the value of things, not just the price. As security walked them out, my mother glanced back. This isn't the girl we raised. You gave me life, I replied. And Vivian gave me a life worth living. She protected me from people who see love as a transaction. Once they were gone, I sank into a chair, the fight draining out of me. Mr. Sterling moved to a chair beside me, not his imposing desk. You should know, he said softly. I am also your godfather. Vivian asked me to be, right after she adopted you. I promised her I would always look out for you, even after she was gone. This new connection to my Aunt Vivian brought a fresh wave of tears. Why didn't she ever tell me I was adopted? She was worried you think she was trying to replace them, instead of just trying to protect you. She wanted you to decide what family meant on your own terms. I confessed that she had influenced me more than anyone, just by being there when no one else was. Mr. Sterling simply nodded. We can file for a restraining order if you'd like. Given their financial motives and their history, a judge would almost certainly grant it. Yes, I said, I think that's exactly what we need to do. Walking out of his office, I felt exhausted but strangely light. The fantasy of my parents coming back for me, a dream I'd clung to for years, had finally come true. It was nothing like I'd imagined and everything Aunt Vivian had prepared me for. She had saved me one last time. But even with the order being filed, they showed up at Aunt Vivian S. My house that night. I saw their rental car pull into the drive as I was making dinner. For a second, I thought about hiding, but a new calm had settled over me since meeting with Sterling. I needed to see this through. They hammered on the doorbell until I finally opened it, blocking the doorway with my body. "You can't be here," I said, my voice steady. "A restraining order is being filed." "We are still your parents," my father shouted, all his composure gone. "You owe us a conversation without lawyers present." "I don't owe you a thing," I answered calmly, "but I'll give you 5 minutes to say your piece. After that, you leave, or I'll call the police." My mother pushed right past me into the house, her eyes greedily scanning the expensive furnishings. "We just want to know why you be so cold," she said. "We made a terrible mistake, but we here to make it right." "By trying to seize my inheritance?" I asked. "That's a funny way of making amends." My father stepped inside, ignoring my protests. "That woman poisoned you against us," he spat. "Vivian was always jealous of me. She just used you to get back at me." "Vivian saved me," I shot back. "She gave me a home, an education, a sense of self-worth. She taught me that love is something you do, not something you just say." "We loved you," my mother insisted. "You were sick. Your father's gambling, my depression, we were addicts. We needed help, not judgment." "I was 13 years old," I reminded her, my voice finally breaking. "I needed parents, not excuses." "Do you have any clue what it felt like to wake up and realize you were both just gone? To wait for the phone to ring for days? To tear apart the apartment looking for a note? Any clue where you went?" My father stared at the floor, unable to look at me. "I checked the mail every single day for a year," I went on, the words I'd swallowed for years pouring out. "I thought you'd at least send a birthday card, something to show you remembered I existed." "We thought of you every day," my mother cried, her face wet with tears. "Thinking isn't doing," I replied. "Vivian never once said the words 'I love you,' not in 15 years, but she showed up, for every scraped knee, every school play, every nightmare. She built a life out of being there." "We're here now," my father said, his voice shifting to that smooth salesman tone I barely remembered. "We can build a new relationship. We can be a family again." "You're here now because Vivian died a wealthy woman," I said bluntly. "If she had died with nothing, would you have even looked me?" Their silence was the only answer I needed. Mr. Sterling gave me the private investigator's reports. "You've known where I was for the last decade. You chose not to contact me until you smelled money." "That's not fair," my mother sobbed. "We were ashamed. We didn't know how to face you." "But you found the courage right after a multi-million-dollar estate was announced." Funny how that timing works. My father's face hardened again. "You have no idea what it was like for us, struggling to get by while my sister sat on a pile of money that should have been shared with family." "Vivian built that fortune herself," I snapped back. "She worked 16 hours for 20 years. What did you do to earn a piece of it?" "I'm her brother," he yelled, "and your father." "So biology means you're entitled to a payday?" I asked, my voice pure Aunt Vivian. "You don't get to abandon your responsibilities for 15 years and then show up expecting a reward." My mother collapsed into a nearby chair, wailing. "How did you get so cold? This isn't who we raised you to be." "You didn't raise me," I reminded her. "You left before the job was done." "Vivian raised me." Headlights swept across the window as a police car pulled quietly into the drive. I'd asked Mr. Sterling to arrange for patrols, just in case. "That would be the police," I told them. "You need to leave now." "This isn't over," my father threatened, grabbing my arm. "You think you've won, but we can make your life hell. We can tell stories about that woman that would ruin her perfect reputation." I pulled my arm away. "And every word you just said," I told him, pointing to the security camera above the door, "is being recorded." Livia had installed those cameras years ago, after their first attempt to extort money. His face went white as he grasped the implications. Anything he said or did could now be used against him in court. "Come on," he muttered to my mother. "She isn't worth the hassle." Those words, calling me an inconvenience instead of a daughter, confirmed everything. This was never about reconciliation. It was always about money. As they walked to the door, my mother glanced back. "You will regret this when you're alone with nothing but money to keep you warm." "Family is everything." "I agree," I said. "Livia was my family. You were just the biological donors who failed to do your job." After they left, I watched through the window as a police officer stopped them in the driveway. There was a short, tense conversation before they drove away. I collapsed onto the floor, the adrenaline finally leaving me. For 15 years, I'd carried a wound that never quite healed, always wanting an explanation for their abandonment. Now I had my answer, and while it was painful, it was also clear. An hour later, Lawson called to check on me. He told me they'd been officially served with the restraining order. They can't legally come within 500 feet or contact you. They claimed it wasn't over. I told him they might cause problems. "Empty threats," he reassured me. "The documents we have would make any legal challenge useless and could even expose them to criminal charges. They were paid to give up custody and then repeatedly tried to squeeze out more money." No court would ever sympathize with that. After we hung up, I wandered through Livia's house, seeing it with new eyes. The formal dining room where she taught me proper table manners. The study where we looked over business reports. The garden where she'd sometimes join me for coffee in comfortable silence. In her bedroom, which I hadn't gone into since she passed, I found a small wooden box on her nightstand that I'd never seen before. Inside was a collection of things that left me breathless. There were report cards, school photos, and just clippings of academic awards I'd won, along with the program from my college graduation with my name highlighted. Underneath these treasured memories was another sealed envelope addressed to me. Unlike the formal letter from Lawson, this note was on her personal stationery. It began simply with Aurora. I have never been good at expressing my emotions. My upbringing and my generation discouraged it. But as I face my own end, I find I regret this. So, let me state plainly what I should have said years ago. I love you not out of obligation, but because of the person you are. Your resilience, your intelligence, and your capacity for kindness, despite early betrayals, have been the greatest joy of my life to witness. I did not give you life, but it has been my privilege to watch you live it. The legal adoption papers were signed years ago, not for your protection, but for my own peace of mind. I wanted the world to recognize you as my daughter in every single way that mattered. Be well, be wise, be happy, Mom. That final word, one we had never spoken in life, broke something open inside me. I wept that night, not for the parents who came back with selfish motives, but for the one who never claimed the title yet had earned it completely. 6 months have passed since that final confrontation with my biological parents. Lawson says they went back to Arizona after one failed attempt to sell a story about Aunt Livia to the local paper. The editor, a longtime friend of Livia's, called Lawson immediately instead. The house finally feels like it's mine. I've repainted some rooms, rearranged the furniture, and added personal touches that reflect my taste while still honoring Livia's elegance. The formal dining room is now my home office, with large monitors sitting a bit awkwardly on the antique mahogany table, where Livia once held business dinners. The business itself is flourishing under my leadership. I've brought in several modern strategies that Livia had resisted, particularly in online marketing and inventory management. Our online presence has grown tremendously, and we have opened 2 new locations. The employees who respected Livia have now transferred that loyalty to me. With this messy increases her influence in my management style. One of the biggest new projects has been launching the Vivian Hughes Foundation, aimed at reconnecting families. Using part of the inheritance, I started a nonprofit that helps children who have faced abandonment or family separation. We provide therapy, educational grants, and housing for young adults aging out of foster care. Through the foundation, I've met others who've gone through things similar to me. Some have reconciled with their biological families, while others have built chosen families with friends and mentors. Every journey is unique, but the common thread is our human need for stable, dependable relationships. My own therapy has progressed, now focusing less on the original abandonment and more on processing the complex feelings stirred up by my parents' return and their true motives. Dr. Freeman helped me see that closure sometimes arrives in unexpected ways. The fantasy of reconciliation is often part of the healing process, as she explained recently. But the reality rarely lives up to that fantasy. Sometimes the most important growth happens when we accept what cannot be changed and build something new instead. 3 months ago, I received a letter from my mother. Unlike our other exchanges, this one had no requests or demands. It was simply an admission of wrongdoing and an expression of regret that felt genuine for the very first time. I have not responded yet, and I might never. The letter sits in its desk drawer, neither rejected nor accepted, as I think about what, if anything, I want from that connection. I've found an unexpected comfort in relationships I once took for granted. Mrs. Grayson, Livia's housekeeper, still visits twice a week. Over time, she's shared stories about Livia from before I arrived, helping me see a more complete picture of the woman who became my true mother. Recently, Mrs. Grayson confided that Livia was terrified when you first came. She had never wanted children and didn't think she had the right personality for motherhood. On the first night you were here, I found her in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, researching child development books online. These glimpses into Livia's private worries and efforts touched me deeply. She took on a responsibility she never asked for, yet she did it with her typical thoroughness and commitment. Lawson has also become a regular part of my life, joining me for dinner monthly and offering advice on both business and personal things. As my godfather, he's taken on more of an uncle-like role than his formal attitude ever suggested was possible. Livia would be proud. He told me recently as we reviewed the Foundation's first quarterly report. He admired not just your business skills, but your resilience. She always worried your early experiences would leave you bitter or unable to trust. Instead, you've turned that experience into a way to help others. After I put romance on hold during Livia's illness and the legal issues, I've started dating again. It's nothing serious yet, but I'm approaching relationships with clearer boundaries and expectations. Livia's example taught me love is shown through consistent actions, not just spoken at convenient times. The most significant change has been internal. The question that haunted me for 15 years, why did they leave me? No longer has the same power. I understand now that their leaving was a reflection of their own limits, not my value. More importantly, I realized that Livia's choice to stay, to commit, and to show up day after day was the decision that mattered most. Last weekend, I went to visit Liv's grave and brought fresh flowers. The headstone is a beautiful black granite with simple lettering, just as she wanted. After the adoption was revealed, I had a small addition made, the word mother engraved beneath her name. As I stood there, it struck me that family isn't just about blood or legal papers, but about the thousands of small choices we make every day. Who shows up? Who stays? Who tells you hard truths? Who creates safety instead of chaos? Livia taught me that true wealth isn't about money. Real abundance comes from integrity, from honoring your commitments, and from trust that is built slowly and maintained carefully. These are the values I carry forward as her most precious legacy. The inheritance she left me was much more than just property and investments. She gave me a way to live with dignity and purpose. She showed me that a chosen family can often be stronger than biological ties. And she showed me that love doesn't need to be said often to be deeply felt. I don't know if I'll ever know if my biological parents are truly sorry, or if they just missed the financial opportunity. In the end, their motives matter less than I thought they did. What really matters is the life I build from here on out, the people I choose to keep close, and the legacy I want to leave behind. Have you ever been forced to completely rethink what family means to you? Do you believe blood relatives automatically get a second chance? Or should trust be earned through love and respect over time? I would really love to read your own stories in the comments section. And if you connected with this story, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel for more true life up experiences. If you know someone navigating tough family issues, please share this with them. It might be what they need to hear. Thank you for listening to my journey, and always remember, sometimes the family you choose is the one that truly heals you.